We're going to start the next session, so I'd love to have everyone's attention. That was quite a previous session, one of the most memorable ones, I think, ever at the Galien Forum. So it's my great pleasure and great honor to have a conversation with Ken Frazier. And I know that everybody here kind of feels like they know him. He's such a presence in our field. And so, the classic thing to say would be, he's a man who needs no introduction. But,
or deserves none.
But I'm actually going to take a few minutes here just to tell you a little bit more so that you know some of the specifics about a remarkable man who has a remarkable career. Of course, he's now the chairman of the board of directors of Merck, and until very recently was Merck's CEO. And I remember the very first time that I met Ken, he said to me, "Mike, there's a reason that Merck is on the planet." And every dimension of that statement is something that he's really lived. Under his leadership, new drugs and new vaccines that have addressed important unmet medical needs have made it to patients. And in addition, he's developed in parallel, and I would say integrated, a philanthropic and humanitarian initiative, both for the company and personally. His personal commitment as a humanitarian and philanthropist is really tremendous. One of the things that I note, and there's a long list of things here, we don't have time to go through them, but he's a co-founder and co-chair of 110, which is a coalition of leading organizations committed to upskilling, hiring, and promoting 1 million Black Americans into family-sustaining jobs. An extremely important and timely initiative now. And then the list of awards and honors is also legion, but I just want to mention a few of them, and then we'll get on to this conversation that I'm really looking forward to. Don't be impatient with me. So he's won the Anti-Defamation League Award for Courage Against Hate. He's won awards from Columbia and Yale for ethics and leadership. He's won the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund National Equal Justice Award. He's gotten Harvard Law School Association's major award. He's been named by Forbes as one of the world's greatest leaders. Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people on the planet, and he became the first recipient of Forbes's Lifetime Achievement Award for Healthcare. And all of us are very fortunate that he also has a commitment to the Galien and has been here time after time helping us understand the directions of the industry and providing some guidance to the industry. Now, Ken and I had a script that had been generated by us and by some very talented people. And when we sat in the room before we came out here, we decided to tear it up. And we're just going to have a conversation. But I want you to realize that the things that we're going to do, we're going to talk about some of the biggest problems facing society and the world now. And Ken is going to solve them for us.
Can I just make a couple of opening comments? So first of all, Mike, I'm so thrilled to be here as a participant in the Galien Foundation's efforts today in the pre-Galien. I came to this industry about 30 years ago. I was a lawyer in the private practice of law in Philadelphia, and one day the phone rang and a great adventure began because my mentor and predecessor twice removed, Roy Vagelos, who's in the front row, hired me out of a law firm and brought me to Merck. And not only did he bring me to Merck, but he gave me an opportunity to do something that never occurred to me. I was a lawyer, and he said, no, you want to understand the fundamental purpose of Merck. And I said to him, Dr. Vagelos, I'd like to contribute to Merck in my own discipline, meaning in the law. he basically said that was ridiculous. You needed to understand the heart and soul of Merck, and I'm very grateful for his mentorship and his sponsorship and his direction over the years. The Galien, a very, very important organization. It has done so much, and I think for the past 50 years or so, it has helped recognize just how much this industry has done. It is the most misrepresented and misunderstood industry that I know of. We had the conversations about addiction before. There are issues here, obviously. But let's just go back and say that since 1975, the rate of cancer mortality has gone down by 25%. It's just amazing. HIV, if you're fortunate to live in certain parts of the world, is now a chronic manageable disease. If you have HIV, you have the same life expectancy as anybody else, right? Due to the work that Roy and others did, the mortality associated with heart conditions is significantly less. We've cured hepatitis A and C. You know, very recently, this industry mobilized with unprecedented speed and skill to deal with COVID-19. And the people in this room, I want to say how much I appreciate the people in this room, how much I really appreciate being with all the nominees for this year's Prix Galien. And when you read what those people have done, there's no question that there's no shortage of talent and there's no shortage of ambition, and that this industry is going to continue to do great things for people going forward. So I just wanted to start by saying that. I'm going to be followed on the stage by a panel of superstars. By the way, Richard, you're in the front row. That last panel was scintillating. It's really hard to follow that last panel because it was so honest and direct. And one of the things I hope that we'll talk about here is what was being talked about on that panel, which is we can invent great drugs, but they have to get to the people who need them, or it really doesn't matter. So let's just talk about COVID-19, okay? The panel that follows me is a panel of absolute superstars. The people who invented the vaccines, the people who invented the monoclonal antibodies, that have actually allowed us to actually address this global pandemic, right? They've operated, it is the best of science. The idea that we had a vaccine 10 months after we first identified this novel pathogen is just an amazing thing. It speaks to the genius in this industry. It speaks to the commitment. People coming into those laboratories at a time when nobody knew how this virus was even being spread. You might remember how we all sanitized our grocery bags when we came on. We had no idea, and yet they came in. And at Merck, our supply chain, I have to say I'm so proud of my colleagues because the ability to make our drugs available to our patients, the fulfillment rates went up after COVID, not down. You would think with everybody having concerns about coming to work, having to have their children schooled at home and everything, it really shows the commitment, the speed with which this industry acted in this respect of COVID to deal with a problem that had a global scale and had to be addressed in that way. I just think this is a great, great tribute to the industry. At the same time, as this last panel talked about, what COVID has also done is it's revealed the kinds of inequities that are in our society, in this country. As you know, the life expectancy for African Americans and Hispanics has gone down by 3% in the last 2 years. 3 years in the last 2 years, compared to 1 year for the overall population. And that has a lot to do with the unequal access, even to these great drugs that we have. We still have an issue with respect to getting medicines to people, overcoming the lack of trust in our society. So there's a lot that we have to do beyond just inventing medicines. And one of the things that I learned when I first came to Merck was that it was important to have the great science to invent these drugs, but it was also important for us to take actions to get these achievements, if you will, to the people who really need them. I'm sorry for that long introduction.
Oh, no, that was great. And I'm going to pick up a couple of threads. One was your comment, the data about life expectancy plunging. And, you know, we can do things about that. you and I made a trip to Botswana about a decade ago, and they showed us life expectancy data in that country. So that country had had a very low life expectancy and climbed over a period of 2 centuries to almost hit European life expectancy. And then the AIDS epidemic came along, and it plummeted. In a period of 5 years, they lost something like 5 or 6 years of life expectancy. So on a population basis, huge impact. And then the spike upward was comparable to the dip because those medicines got to the people in that country. So you've been talking now at the beginning about health disparities in the first world. And you know, I know that you recently had a chance to meet with His Holiness the Pope, and I'm sure that global health must have been a topic that came up. So I'd love to, if you'd share with us a little bit about what that conversation was and tell us a little bit of your views on global health.
Okay. So I was very fortunate to meet with His Holiness. He invited me to his office in the Vatican. By the way, very good artwork in his office. I just want to make that point. And he invited me. I was in Italy, and I was surprised that I got a letter from the Holy Father. But it turns out, he, as you know, may know, he's the first Jesuit pope in a couple of 100 years. He's actually trained as a chemist. So he was very interested. He said, you know, I learned from the Merck Index when I was a young chemist, and I wanted to come have a conversation with you. I won't go through everything in the conversation. He said 2 things that struck me. Number one was, he said, you know, as a pope, you get to preside over the customs and the traditions and the relics of the church, including the naming of the saints, he said. But, you know, in reality, the saint-sinner distinction's meaningless because we're all sinners. But the question is, can we distinguish between the rational and the irrational in our world? And we have to guard against irrationality. So when we talk about COVID-19, we're going to talk about the impacts of irrationality, even when we have, for example, vaccines. So he was right about that. The second thing he said is Merck has a tradition of using its medicines and its resources to help the world's poor, but you can never do enough on that scale. So continue to do that. He talked about Mectizan, Roy's here, and you know, obviously for Merck people, the decision to give that drug away for river blindness everywhere it's needed for as long as it's needed is something that we're trying to stand up in our generation of Merck people and make sure that we are actually living up to that standard and that ethos.
The statement about irrationality and rationality, it brings me to, we're seeing it, of course. We're all in this movie of seeing it with the acceptance or non-acceptance of the vaccine. But one of the things that's fueling this is misinformation versus facts and truth. Mm-hmm. And is it hopeless to try to put the genie back in the bottle, or is there anything that you think can be done to in terms of education or information that can at least minimize this human trait of irrationality?
So we heard the conversation in the last panel about how people are being predisposed to certain kinds of information. And before I even get to social media, I think we got to recognize that there was already a gap in trust in our society before the vaccines were developed, right? So in the African American community, people remember people being mistreated in clinical trials like the Tuskegee experiments, and that's a big issue for people. There was already a huge amount of vaccine hesitancy inside the country before the COVID-19 vaccine came along. I think if you look at surveys, the trust in government has plummeted. I think if you look at how we were learning information in real time about this disease, early information turned out to be superseded by subsequent information, and people like to have definitive answers when something's evolving. You know, so you hear all the critiques of, you know, when you see Dr. Fauci on Face the Nation or Meet the Press, they like to say, well, yeah, but you said this in February 2020. Now you're saying something that's inconsistent. And of course, people at the CDC get the same thing. And you know, what they're really saying is, we needed some experience with this virus. We didn't know this virus. We weren't familiar with this virus. So there was a background, Mike, of a lack of trust before all of this happened. Now we get to social media, which I think has had a tremendous impact on our nation, period. Look at the impact that it's had on our political life in this nation. And so for many people getting information that's not curated, that's not edited, they go to social media. I was just saying that if you listen to the CDC, their advice changes over time as the science changes. But social media, they have the answers, right? They are very definite, right? I have gotten so many letters since our experimental antiviral was, we made the data available, and I get so many letters saying, I learned from social media that you're rebranding this drug for river blindness, Mectizan, ivermectin, and I'm told that you don't want us to have ivermectin because it's off patent and you can't make money off of it. And I'm thinking, this is from the bizarro world. But the fact of the matter, coming back to the issue that you raised, there is a huge amount of misinformation. And it's in a country that is politically divided already. So there's the misinformation, and there's the predisposition of some people in our country to be opposed to what other people think. You know, I saw a piece of data the other day that said, for the first time in our country's history, commonality is determined not by race, not by religion, not by region or educational level. It's determined by political affiliation. And so now we live in a country where wearing a mask is a political statement, and taking a vaccine, unfortunately, has become a political statement. So social media had its role, but it already found its way into a nation that had low amounts of scientific and medical literacy and was already greatly divided.
I want to pick up on a phrase that you used, which was about making money. So I want to turn the conversation a bit. Of course, capitalism has been terrific at spurring innovation. It's one of the motivators and one of the drives that has given us inventions not only in the biopharmaceutical industry, but the telephone, computers, et cetera. But it seems like it's a mixed blessing at times, and there are aspects of it that aren't working for some of the things that we've just spoken about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about capitalism and how it can be harnessed as optimized, let's put it that way, to get the best results for society.
So I have to first say that as a child of the 60s and 70s, I never thought that I would be sitting on a stage defending free enterprise. Okay? There's many ironies in life. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, as you just said, Mike, free enterprise does create the opportunity to find these kinds of amazing cures. I mean, what happened with these vaccines? Let's use that as an example. As I understand it, something like 800 vaccines and treatments are under research now, according to the FDA. Most of them will fail. Most of them will be projects that will never make back their cost of capital. But if we didn't have people who are willing to invest in this industry, okay, knowing the risks, knowing the chances of failure are so great, it's so asymmetrical when you're inventing new things towards failure. If we didn't have a system that rewarded that, I don't know how we would do what we do. And you know, I think our profession is a noble one, but the capital markets have to get their return on investment. Now, having said that, as a person who allocated capital inside Merck for many, many years, I really was pleased that I was mentored and directed in terms of how I think about my job every day. And I realized that I didn't have to maximize the profit, right? I needed to think about how did I optimize the return to my shareholders, and how did I think about public health. So the idea that financial return for shareholders is antithetical to societal return is false. And by the way, that's the way capitalism used to be in this country. I'm sitting here because I'm the son of a janitor who had 9 children. And my mother didn't work out of the home. He was a janitor for UPS. In the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s when I was coming along, that was capitalism as it was known in those days. People got paid a family-sustaining wage, even though they had these pretty humble jobs. You know, a person could pay their mortgage. They could, you know, take care of their families. I think it's not, that there's nothing wrong with capitalism. I think some of the people who preside over important institutions have let it become sort of a runaway form of capitalism. And I think when that happens, again, there's a lack of trust in society. When people look at how people run these institutions, and they can see that people are running the institutions not for the greater good, but also, you know, but basically for their own self-interest. So I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm anti-capitalist. I'm very pro-free enterprise. But like anything, taken to an extreme, puts you in a situation where people see the dark side of that. And right now in Washington, the fate of the industry is being debated in the halls of Congress right now. There are proposals to the problem. We have to be very clear. The status quo in terms of patient access and patient affordability is unacceptable. And yet, some of the solutions that are being proposed in Washington are terrible. They would destroy the basis for this industry. I mean, we're here to celebrate over 50 years of progress. If some of these things happen, and I know the one example of that is I'm on the Hill all the time where people talk about secretarial negotiation, and I say, well, our experience with Medicaid is that the government now in 2024 will get a Medicaid rebate that will be more than 100% of the price of the drug. That's how good they are at negotiating, you know? We can't have that happen. If we can set prices in the United States at the levels at which they are set around the rest of the world, the reality of the world, we've done the analysis at Merck, something like 40% of our projects in our research labs become NPV negative automatically if we're paid the average price in Europe. So people don't like to hear it, but I often say on the Hill, the only thing worse than Americans paying more than others for drugs is Americans not paying more than others for drugs, because there simply would not be the capital basis. Now, having said that, I'm going to come back to what I was saying. Companies like Merck have to think about how we can optimize patient access while at the same time optimizing a fair return to our shareholders.
Yeah. And it's your feeling that investors and shareholders understand that or will buy into it when it's set as a good example?
I believe that's right. I think that the whole ESG movement that we're seeing is because people recognize that companies have to run themselves in a sustainable way. And, you know, obviously I've only had the privilege of being the CEO of one company, but recently, you know, our antiviral medicine, molnupiravir, which we hope will get approval by FDA and other regulatory agencies around the world, it could make a big difference. Obviously, we know that vaccines should be the front line of defense, there's no question. But unfortunately, 85% of the vaccines that have been distributed in the world so far have been distributed in what we call the first world. And as Dr. Vagelos knows from giving away the Mectizan drug, Mectizan requires 1 pill per person per year. That's pretty easy administration, you would think. But getting that to the last mile was very hard. We had to have partnerships with other organizations around the world to get it to the people who needed it. They were the farthest from the loading dock at Merck, as you could imagine, not just geographically, all right? So for us, when we came forward with this drug, we said we have to, before we get the data, we have to have generic licenses in place with Indian manufacturers. And now I'm very proud that we've put it into the UN patent pool so it can be made available in all the low-income and low-middle-income countries. We haven't had investors say anything bad about that. I think we sometimes exaggerate what we have to do to please investors. And I think for this industry, when you look at the world right now, I think the biggest challenges that we face are poverty, disease, and climate. And I think that the only way we're going to solve those big issues is with businesses. But those businesses have to be committed to not just serving their shareholders, but also serving the common good. Because, you know, frankly, we see in this particular COVID situation with this pathogen, we're getting variants all the time. It's not enough for us to protect ourselves in the United States, right? I mean, we're living in a world, and unless everyone's protected, in a sense, no one's protected from this highly contagious pathogen. So that's a classic example of why business has to take the big view, the longer view. And I think many CEOs, it's referred to as stakeholder capital. I'll give one little plug for Merck here and I'll stop. In 1952, the CEO of Merck was on the cover of Time magazine. I tell my children that's like being on every social media platform at the same time, okay? They can't imagine. But he was on the cover of Time magazine because he made a graduation speech at a medical school in Virginia. And at that speech, he said, medicine is for the people, not for the profits. And every Merck employee knows that saying, and they hold the CEO of Merck accountable in terms of, are your actions consistent with the stated objective of the company?
Yeah. I'm glad you gave that example of George Merck, because you and I have faced some interesting decisions during the time that we worked together. And one of the things I used to do was to invoke the image of George Merck, who was a very tall guy, walking into my office and saying, are you doing my name proud or not when you make a decision? So you've mentioned now the pandemic and COVID a couple of times, and I've heard you use the phrase health security before. And it's something I'm very interested in because I don't believe that our health system or sick care system, which is problematic, but also does a very good job for certain kinds of problems, but it comes up short in terms of health security if you compare that to defense and homeland security. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about what's been revealed and where we might go in the area of kind of patching that big hole.
So I think about health security in two different ways. So first of all, as the last panel talked about, there are gaping holes in the U.S. healthcare system, right? So for certain people in our country, you know, they don't have access to a great healthcare system. We have the best healthcare system in the world if you have coverage. If you don't have coverage, as we just heard, for people with, it was just scandalous what we heard in the last panel in terms of the inability of people to be treated for addiction, right? So that's a hole. I'm from the inner city of Philadelphia. I was raised in the inner city of Philadelphia. We talked about the last mile in Botswana. The last mile in North Philadelphia is just as hard to get through. Right. And there are people who don't have access. And these issues that we talked about, mental health, huge issue. We haven't talked about COVID-19. We know that the rate of diagnosed mental illness has quadrupled. We know what has happened to substance abuse. We know what's happened to suicide during this period of time. Then there's the whole cardiometabolic issue because these neighborhoods, rural and urban, are food deserts. And in addition to the trauma, food is one of the things that they can self-medicate with, just like opioids. And so we have diabetes, which is incredible in this neighborhood. My old neighborhood, so the rate of people having a stroke is like 15 times the national average. And it's all because so there's that whole health insecurity in our society because people don't have access to health care and don't have access to coverage. There's another form of health insecurity that I think is important too, and that is our preparedness for the next pandemic, right? You and I were working at the company where after 9/11, all of a sudden with anthrax and everything else, people thought we needed to be focused on biosecurity, and then it went away, and people lost their attention, right? So we have to be thinking about what is it that we can do now, public-private partnerships, to position ourselves for the next pandemic. In this case, it was a virus. In our industry, one of the things that gets neglected because there's no real return on investment is antibiotic research. And we know that resistant forms of bacteria are they're killing more people according to reports than even climate is right now, okay? And yet there's no economic incentive. We continue to do it at Merck, as you know, but there has to be an economic incentives. As Richard just said in the last panel, the work that his company's doing, they do it without really much support from the healthcare system or the government. We've got to fix those things. And if we're going to deal with the next pandemic, we've got to be thinking now about the right kind of research in order for us to be prepared.
Right. You know, I've just had the experience of working closely with Moderna on the vaccine because the firm I'm at, Flagship, created it, right? Founded it. Right. And if you look, you know, that vaccine, although it's got government funding at the end for clinical trials, the invention of the vaccine is clearly done by private enterprise.
Absolutely.
And so the question is, in this health security, are there models that we can use? Because I think we were lucky, relying on private industry almost exclusively to, granted they worked on a base of academic research, but relying on them entirely to come up with this and take the big gambles that were taken, I'm not sure we can rely on that in the future. I don't know what you think.
So I think that the industry is able to do the scientific research that they need to do. I mean, you know, Regeneron did the work that led for years to create the platform for their COVID-19 monoclonal antibodies. You know, I have a lot of respect for the work that Moderna did to put in place the systems to actually produce the vaccine, Pfizer, obviously. But you're right. I mean, if we're really going to be prepared for these pandemics, I don't think we can ask the companies to take all the necessary steps. We have to have the right kind of partnership with our government and governments around the world. I'll use the antibiotic example as an example. At the end of the day, we want to develop a new antibiotic. But if we're going to be responsible stewards of that, we want to put that new antibiotic in a drawer and only use it for those patients who are resistant to commonly used antibiotics. Well, that doesn't meet the needs of our business model because we don't want to spend billions of dollars to invent a drug just to put it in the closet and not use it. And yet that's what society needs. So for me, I think it's really about us recognizing the importance of science. And that's where I think the Galien Foundation is so important, right? When we solve these problems like COVID-19, that was rapid, the 10 months to develop a vaccine, but this goes back to the 1970s. And the way that I think about what the Galien Foundation does is that it promotes science, and it takes waves and waves and waves of science over a long period of time, like waves in the ocean crashing up against some kind of, you know, beachhead. In order for us to knock that down, it takes many waves and waves. And I think that's the purpose of the Galien Foundation, to support the fundamental science that will be there when we need it.
Thanks. Ken, I've got one last question for you. You've touched so many lives and influenced so many people, including most of the people in this room. I think everyone's curious about what's next for you, or at least what's motivating you for the next chapter in your life.
Well, I do think that the issues of inequity in our society, you know, my life is the result of opportunities that people gave me. I have siblings, grew up in the same house, who weren't given those opportunities. I believe that talent is evenly distributed in society, but opportunity isn't. So I want to be able to do something around health opportunity, educational opportunity, and 110, the organization you made reference to, is about taking 1 million Black Americans who lack a 4-year degree and allowing them to become a part of our society by having family-sustaining wages. So if I can help someone else have opportunity, then maybe I did something right. I don't know.
Perfect. Ken, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.